I am the person who is at the right place at the right time. I am the intersection of my communities. I am constituted by that because there's nothing else that is me other than that.
Welcome to The Feedback Loop, a Sino Global Capital podcast where we keep you in the loop about the most pressing issues in Web3 today. I'm your host, Mona Hamdy, a Harvard teaching fellow with 20 years of experience in nonprofit and sustainable development. I started using emerging technologies 15 years ago, working with remote peoples to create new economies based on the reversal of climate change. And today, I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Sino, where I hope to bring beneficial technologies to the most forgotten corners of this planet. On today's episode, I'm joined by my good friend and decentralized social identity expert, Glen Weyl. Glen is an economist and researcher at Microsoft Research, is based in New England, and is the author of Radical Markets, Uprooting Capitalism and Democracy for a Just Society. Additionally, he is the co-creator of Quadratic voting, a collective decision-making procedure designed to allow fine-grained expression of how strongly a population feels about an issue. And quadratic funding, a method of radically and democratically dispersing resources. Glen, I'm really excited to have you on the feedback loop with me today to talk about all things around quadratic voting, around souls and soul-based tokens. So let's jump right into it.
Mona, there's literally no one I'd rather be talking to about this than you. So thanks for having me.
Well, let's see. I hope you feel that way at the end of our chat today. Let's get into a little bit of the background and the history of the thought behind the root of all of this in your work with Radical Exchange.
The way I ended up working on this topic really came out of experiments. I was an economist before I knew anything about the Web3 space. I was into new ways of imagining how we make decisions together. Quadratic voting was leading among those. Even though it was written as an economics theory paper, really found its community with Web3 people who started using it for DAO governance and extensions of it for allocating funding, as you mentioned. And as they did, it became immediately apparent that the biggest challenge it faced was around identification. That's because quadratic voting tries to have democratic principles together with sort of market or capitalist type principles. So it tries to allow the number of people who are supporting something and not just the amount of money supporting it to matter. As soon as that happens, there's this problem that's usually called the Sybil problem in the Web3 space.
I'm curious as an American and the current sort of political climate and re-envisioning what it means to be a citizen, what it means to vote. And we know that in the Web3 space that we've seen a lot of quadratic voting functions come out of the sort of Gitcoin grant community, right? So we've seen a lot of traction in that space for sure as DAO governance expands and the ideas around what it means to collectively own something expands.
Many people take the issue of identity and belonging and the right to vote for granted, either because they live in a non-democratic country where that doesn't happen, or they live in a democratic country where what democracy means to them is the right to vote in that nation's elections according to some identity procedure that's been established for hundreds of years. But that's just not the world that I grew up in, effectively, and it's not at all the world in Web3. So you mentioned I'm an American. I'm also a German. So I've always had multiple affiliations. And in Web3, people have often dozens of affiliations. And managing the right to participate in those processes becomes something that's not just an automatic assumption that's way in the background, but like a central feature of the technical design of systems. And I think that it was that notion that in this world, those ideas of identity are live and contested and evolving that has really triggered the work that I've been doing most recently on soul-bound tokens.
Is that tied to your notion of mapping between people and capital, or people and sort of an issue and topic, what you call voice? One
approach to dealing with this issue of allegiances that are not clearly defined is what Balaji Srinivasan has called, exit, or the network state, where you just get around it by people being able to move to whatever jurisdiction or whatever organization serves them best. But if you're someone like me who doesn't think that, who on the one hand sees the dynamism of these social arrangements, who doesn't think that they're fixed in stone, but on the other hand, doesn't think people can freely move to whatever they want to align themselves to, that people have loyalties and connections that are persistent, then it becomes critical that people can't just move, but that they can speak and say what they want from their communities.
Do you think, Glenn, that this idea of people being bound by their allegiances or their affinities as we sort of approach more complex versions of ourselves, right? So we have our physical bodies in these physical communities, and we have our digital presences too. I know the idea of that digital extension, like the radically extended human in this instance, involves a digital extension of your identity. How does this work as we become increasingly complex, as our physical bodies might be connected in one way, and that extension of our digital presence and our digital identity might be interpolated in a different way? As an individual, where does one begin and another end? How do we look in the future if we move in that way?
Well, I think that there are two answers to that question that like technology is today giving, and then there's a different answer, which I think is the right one. One answer is that we're all just part of like one big intelligence, and that like AI will map that out, and then it won't even matter. And a second answer is like, now that nation states are breaking down, physical localities breaking down, like the individual human is going to be like the thing that gets liberated. Then everything will just like flow to that sovereign individual. And I think both of those answers are wrong, because just as much as existing social institutions are being destabilized, who we are is being equally destabilized. Like we're losing a sense of ourself. We're, as you said, dissolving. Both the AI vision that like we're all going to dissolve into this whole, and the ultra individualist vision are like capturing elements of the truth, but they're like only looking at one element when both elements are simultaneously accelerating.
Yeah.
And actually, as both simultaneously accelerate, what actually happens is that the complexity of those social interrelations is what's proliferating, not either the isolated individual or the whole. One vision of social credit is that anything that tries to bring technology and quantification into social relations sort of inevitably is going to create like a surveillance state out of our social lives. My perspective is really that we don't have the choice to just ignore the advance of technology in how we organize our lives. We have a choice of what future we want technology to help us organize. And one future is focused on data processing, top-down surveillance, et cetera. A second future is focused on sort of like financial entrepreneurship and speculation and accumulation. And I think there's an alternative, and the alternative is way more complex and way more diverse, and therefore has all kinds of pitfalls. But it involves actually using technology to map, extend, and enrich the role of social relationships. And social relationships are by their nature not universal and top down. They're not separate and individual. They're complex, multi-level, rich, diverse, cultural.
I really think that one of the greatest strengths is sort of what was embodied in the last few of your tweets, which was the idea of identity, and the idea that we really do have a sort of misdefinition, or we're not defining things properly around what it means to be identity, around universal basic income and that sort of credit thing. And that all of these criticisms that are sort of, coming from this place of actually being dystopian almost sounds like a misreading of your work, and a misreading based on these sort of definitions.
I mean, I think that a lot of people's conception of identity, on the one hand, too narrow, and on the other hand, too broad, in the sense that they think that identity means government issued documents or, issued by some authority, rather than that those documents are meant to be a thin way of capturing the true richness of all of the social connections that constitute me. And that if we're able to build systems that represent that more fully, that actually those documents will become anachronisms. And once you understand things in that broader context of social relationships that constitute who I am, then it becomes clear that a lot of the technologies proposed, while they might be able to capture some aspect of what we're after, aren't addressed at the whole problem. In that sense, I think a lot of the territory grabbing or ground staking doesn't really make a lot of sense once you think about identity in this broader context, because identity in this broader context at some level captures most, if not all, of what we call data or relationships. And so identity is something we can struggle towards, that we might eventually make progress on. It's not something that can be captured by one technology, certainly not any technology I've come close to describing.
The idea of identity being captured in that way seems to be one of the criticisms of your work that you actively rebut.
Part of my identity is how it feels proprioceptively to be me. That is, proprioception is like if I put out my arm and I feel that it's heavy, I'm not feeling that through my touch or my smell or my taste. I'm feeling that through my internal sensory experience. That's a huge part of my identity. That's part of my identity that not only no verifiable credential or soulbound token is ever going to be able to capture, but that I don't even have the capacity, speaking to you here, to communicate in any way. We can only aspire to eventually be able to share with another person someday. The notion that any particular technology is going to be the solution for identity is a mirage. And the soulbound tokens, as we describe them, certainly as they're starting to be implemented, are just able to aspire to capture some small fragments of what identity might mean. The benefit that they bring is that those fragments might enable us to do some things other than just speculate or surveil. It might let us do something beyond that. And if we want a future that's not completely characterized by speculation and surveillance, then it's worth investing in them.
A problem with the social credit system and your response to the idea that this might be considered largely dystopian has to do with the fact that this score would probably, and in your words, be seen that the score undermines social context rather than leverages it. And that your problem with this isn't so much the fact that it's a social credit scoring system, as that is the basis for human interaction and basically the beginning of our species since recorded time, but the surveillance system or the enforcement mechanisms around that might happen if it were in a government system.
All of us have some scoring system that we apply to all of our social interactions. We all have some way of evaluating the people that we interact with and how good they've been to us and how much we value interacting them with in the future, how much we trust them and so forth. The problem with scores is not that anyone has them, but that a single score might be used by all people to evaluate someone in all circumstances. And that naturally creates, putting aside anything about surveillance, a system of hierarchical ranking and inequality that doesn't serve anyone well. It just sets, the winners and the losers up rather than the matches and the collaborations and the cultures. That, to me, undermines sociality, because the core of sociality is not a competition, but a set of relationships. And there will be elements of competition in those relationships, of course. People talk about beauty or attractiveness or whatever. The true value of relationships, romantic relationships, is match. As we get to, greater and greater degrees of social complexity, that moves from a pair to groups, to teams, to nations. And having good connections, not having good quality, is what matters. And so scores that reduce our sociality for all people to one stack ranking do violence to the whole concept of sociality.
So this sounds a lot like your thoughts on what you call plurality. And I know plurality has this nuance for you and for a way that you see social organization in the future. A concern that seems to reverberate is maybe the disparity between what it would look like when these ranked populations, at large scale, global population at the size of 8 billion people, to ensure that you do have match that are more inclusive. How can we move toward that, as opposed to perhaps some of the worries about what a future might look like, and that this technology might actually exacerbate the divides between people, as opposed to finding ways to create radically extended communities that are more inclusive?
We invented money as this single reductive thing to let us when we didn't have much ability to compute, deal with people who were very far away from us, when we couldn't keep track of all those social relations. So we invented this thing, and it's not just money, it's all these ranking systems, all these reductive, one-dimensional views, so that we could keep track of things when we were dealing with way more people than we could hope to remember all the social nuance and relationships to. But now, digital revolution has given us the possibility of maintaining far more of that social richness, but extended to communities of millions and maybe even billions. And that is, to me, the great promise of, an internet society.
How realistic and how likely are we, where we are right now in 2022, to come toward your vision of decentralized society, DSOC?
I don't know how feasible any of these things are. We may all die in nuclear war, but I don't see a non-catastrophic or dystopian radical future available to us that doesn't embrace that. I see the AI takes over and rules. I see the society collapses. Everybody goes to their own, island and makes bioweapons, and we all die. I also see the glimmer of a world we might want to live in, where we have richer and more complex relationships with more people, because technology lets us make sense of all that. I hope we can get there, because I don't want to live in either of those alternatives.
That is what was very interesting about your latest work that you on soulbound tokens to me, Glen, was that it actually felt like a love letter. It felt very much like a person who has attachments, not just to where those radical markets might take us and that digitally extended future that we might have, but to the physical space and the physical connections that we have in our communities as individuals to in the relationship aspect of humans. And I know that probably sounds a little hokey, but to me, that's even the basis of DAOs, right? It's the basis of anything that we see people communing in whatever aspect. I want to talk a little bit about that, about the fact that how have your relationships, how has seeing those great income disparities or those great access disparities influenced that? And where and how, what might we be able to bring about something that's not as dystopian as those real existential threats that you face? I know that in the classroom, we see students who are having existential crises about things that are not outside the realm of possibility. They're not just existential threats. They are actual things that are happening to generations younger than us. And that's sort of looming in the background as they go about the daily lives of becoming young adults and maturing into adulthood. And your paper, Glen, felt like that to me. It felt like something that was a gift from your soul as you dedicated in Spanish to the people that you love.
There was a double meaning of that dedication in Spanish. My daughter is named Alma, and Alma is soul in Spanish. And so it was both dedicated to my daughter, and it was committed to my soul and coming from my soul. And in fact, my daughter, Alma's name, arose precisely from this logic. Alma is one of the few names that is a native and common name in Spanish, English, Hebrew, and German. And in fact, it means different things in some of those languages, but it is a common name in all of them. And those are the sort of cultures to which I feel most attached. And so in a very real sense, her name represents her intersectional identity within those societies. And so it couldn't be more appropriate that her name is the title of much of the work.
It gives me hope that you are thinking in that way. How much of that hope do you think we get to pass on to the generations that come next? Where will DSOC take us if we do it right?
I think that the chance that we have, I don't think that the institutions that we're imagining building are going to be mostly adopted even by our generation. But I think there's a set of people who will get the opportunity to shape their own futures, and will grow up in the milieu of these being live possibilities. I hope they'll grow up with leaders like Audrey Tong, who I'm writing a book with now, I hope that they'll grow up with those people as live possible heroes and chart courses inspired by their examples in a way that I'm too old to be capable of.
It sounds like this paper and your recent corpus of work actually wasn't even written for us. I get the sense that perhaps you're writing it for a future time or a future place that hasn't happened yet.
And I'm sure I don't understand the work. The more that it goes on, the more I realize I don't understand it. One of the most interesting exchanges I've been having recently is with a Fields Medal winning mathematician named Michael Friedman, who is about to come out with today, or certainly before this podcast goes live, just probably one of the most touching things anyone's ever written about my work, and is now working on extending much of it to connect it to quantum mechanics and show a formal equivalence between the particle wave duality in quantum mechanics
Oof.
and the individual community duality that I was just referring to earlier. Yeah. And that was very much inspired by all this quadratic stuff in a way that I certainly didn't understand. I hope that I'm opening the door to things I can't imagine.
You've been inspired and have inspired many people. You mentioned Audrey, you mentioned Michael, you have worked with Vitalik and with Jaron Jaron Lanier, of course, and many, many others. What is the deal with this nexus of work? I think that I've heard quantum mechanics referenced before with your work, and it came out of radical exchange. Let's talk a little bit about what radical exchange was meant to be, because that sounds precisely like the sweet spot of this thing that you created.
John Dewey is one of my favorite thinkers. And John Dewey had a vision of the expert in society that I think is in some ways parallel to, in some ways much more enlightened than the vision of the founder that's usually described in like sort of the Peter Thiel, mythology. His idea is that the expert is someone who is in one sense kind of like a Weberian charismatic leader. So that sort of parallels the usual founder narrative, somebody who inspires and leads and builds something new, but in another sense is really a democratic servant. So the expert is actually a mirror to a community that is already laden, that's already created by the new possibilities of technology, a set of intersections of existing communities that was just waiting to be expressed to itself. And that ultimately that leader is not the liberated individual independent of social groups. They're just the democratically elected leader of a community that doesn't exist yet. Ultimately, they're just accountable to that community and will dissolve into that community once it recognizes itself to exist. That's, I think, how I think about the radical exchange community and, what I'm trying to create. Not that it is a thing of me, but it's a thing of a set of people who don't yet know that they're there. And that I hope to help them see themselves.
And it seems like they are. Again, your ideas about plurality and difference seem to be manifest in radical exchange, because you do have quantum physicists and artists and musicians and economists coming together to make those communities. And I know that it's been growing. Tell us a little bit about how those movements are spreading.
Well, I think this fall will be an interesting illustration because due to precisely this nature, in October, there were two events that we couldn't pass up leading that are going to be happening on opposite ends of the planet at the same time. One in Bogota, Colombia, and one in Warsaw, Poland. One concurrent with DevCon, where we're going to be showcasing the success of democratic innovation in Latin American cities and the way that interacts with democratic technology, working in collaboration with the US State Department and with the IE University in Spain, and simultaneously one in Warsaw, where we're going to be showcasing some of the ways that we're working to help Ukrainian refugees with some of this soul-bound technology, and to reimagine governance in Eastern Europe in the wake of crises of governance in that region. So those are that's sort of a representation of the way in which the things have just been spreading out and getting a life of their own in different places around the world.
Do you see it springing up in a way that is, insofar that it has to be decentralized, that it comes from centralized locuses of power or capital or technology or energy? Or is it this grassroots movement that we sort of see with Radical Exchange, kind of the blueprint here?
Ultimately, I think it's going to have to be all of the above, because new things come from intersections. That's again the Stewian philosophy. If there was any sector of our world that was doing exactly what I would hope it could be doing, I wouldn't have to be doing the work that I'm doing. So it's ultimately, and yet you can't start from nothing. So it's ultimately by bringing many of those forces together and having them intersect in productive ways that I think we get progress. So yes, we work with the government of Taiwan. We're working with governments in Eastern Europe. We're working with governments in Latin America. Yes, I work at Microsoft, and we do technical partnerships with a whole range of private entities. Yes, our primary foot is in the civil sector. Yes, we're working on films and artworks and cultural outlets. So at the intersection of the many dysfunctions of all those parts of society, I think there's room for hope.
So that's like a D, all of the above kind of answer, right? Like, do you think that there's more promise if it comes out of like the private sector and there's sort of this, decentralized, like this sort of UBI or these sort of misnomer credit systems? Or is it something that comes out of governments and something around CBDCs, for example, some sort of actual physical exchange that's very government based, as you say? Where is there more promise for the rest of us, do you think?
I think it works unless all those things happen simultaneously. All of the above may seem vague, but it's also almost all of the space. Like if you draw a little diagram and like the extreme points are like civil sector, government sector, and private sector, almost all the spaces in the triangle in between. And the most exciting spaces are closest to the center of that triangle. The dynamism and experimentation of the private sector is, except in a few places like Taiwan, you don't find among public institutions. And yet that most commonly turns towards like absurd speculation and Ponzi schemes left to its own devices. The social sector has more live possibilities and yet is usually funded by plutocrats of various kinds and or is sort of incapable of scaling.
It was really interesting, something that I noted, that you sort of lumped all of the criticism of DSOC together in sort of the same breath, as mentioning, obviously, your relationship with Audrey and with Taiwan in some of the sort of hope and the potential for account-based tokens or soul-based tokens. But you basically came out and said, listen, we listed 5 applications on the front page, and basically nobody's been able to rebut it effectively. Why do you think that is? I mean, other than the fact that it's obviously the most perfect paper that you've ever written, why do you think that the criticisms are falling short?
Well, look, I love everyone who engages in the conversation. I think that there's been a lot of focus on people who have one particular technical standard that they're very committed to, and they want to sort of take some element of like the semiotic territory, like identity or something like this, and be like, that belongs to us, and sort of like, urinate around it or something like that, And then if you like put a toe adjacent to it, they are very concerned that you're infringing on that domain, or they think that anything that has a glimmer of that automatically has to have various technical properties that they're very committed to, like minimum disclosure or certain notions of privacy and so forth. But the reality is that like the space is just much more fluid than that. And the affordances that you need for different applications are much richer and more diverse than can be achieved by a simple mapping of that sort.
I think it's really interesting that your highest praise and your greatest criticism, which you say, obviously fall short, come from the DeFi community and come from the crypto community. Why is it sticking so much with the crypto community, and how did you find yourself so much in that particular niche?
I think that the most exciting thing about the crypto community is that it affords what Hannah Arendt called a moment of public freedom. There's private freedom, which is the ability to, like, within a given system, do what you want. And then public freedom is a way to, like, set patterns that might create a new way of living together in the future. And I think that the exciting thing about the crypto space is that feeling of public freedom, the sense that these experiments that we're doing together might be patterns that others will follow and that will become a new fabric of life. And I've found that incredibly invigorating, despite all of the problems and all of the easiest things that people jump to afforded with that freedom. That freedom will be wasted by many, but it's still a beautiful thing to play with.
I have to admit, Glenn, it gives me a lot of hope to think that that might actually be the birthright of our peoples. And I want to see a world in which there's more universal access to opportunities like the ones that you and Pooja and Vitalik laid out for all of the peoples of this earth. I just am having a really hard time lately believing that it might actually be true and that it might actually be in the cards for us as an entire planet. Give me some hope, Glenn. Tell me how you see this lining up in a way for that love letter to the future. What's going on that might actually give someone who's eternally optimistic about this and about this reaching every corner of the earth to say that it might actually be viable and that history is not over, as it were.
I think that the greatest progress is usually achieved on the edge of disaster. The Second World War gave birth to the modern welfare state. The Civil War ended slavery. I think that it is in those darkest moments that you can see lights. That doesn't mean that we're guaranteed to make it through. You could well fall into the abyss, and maybe that's even the most likely outcome. But I don't think that we can expect to have a chance at that sort of change without running past the darkest, moments in our history.
Glenn, it seems like it gets harder. I want to think that it's only darkest before the dawn. And I do desperately want to be anxiously engaged in anything that brings a brighter day, even if it's for that unseen future, right? So writing this for the peoples of the future who might actually be able to determine their autonomy and their identity in the ways that you've mapped out are hugely inspirational to me as you're writing for people who might not even exist yet. They might not actually even be here to be able to partake in the systems that you're envisioning. How have you yourself seen the changes in your own work evolve, and what's next for Glen Weyl? What are you thinking on these days?
I think that if I could predict my future, I wouldn't have nearly as exciting of a ride as I've had. I expected the last 6 months to primarily be writing a book with Audrey, which I still intend to do. It's the most exciting thing that I'm working on. And this DSOC thing just happened because I saw the opportunity with Pooja. I saw the moment. I saw that something needed to be said. I even remember messaging you a couple months before this paper came out and saying, this needs to be said now. This is the right moment.
Tell me a little bit more about that, Glenn. Let's talk about that. Your work with Audrey is overwhelming and a universe. And it's, tell me about the Pooja moment and how you and Pooja and Vitalik came together.
There was just the Gitcoin people were working on the next iteration of their quadratic funding work. I realized that a bunch of the limitations might be overcome using the soulbound token thing. And then I started realizing, oh, wow, this actually gives an approach towards so many of the things that have been aspirations of mine in a way that's very continuous with what's going on in the Web3 community. Just being on an all right trajectory and being self-sustaining was starting to falter. And all of those things sort of came together. It was like every day I was talking to Pooja, there were more and more possibilities of what this could enable pouring out of me. I felt like it had to be expressed. And I think Vitalik felt excited by it. So we all ended up working together on it.
I want to live in that world, Glenn. It influenced a lot of the way that I thought about interacting with our guests and interacting with our industry, right? Was the idea that seeing the human in the networked web of all of the influences and all of the people who have impacted them is something that I hope we get to do through this podcast, is get to know you as a human and get to know your work through the lens of what makes Glen, and the soul-bound work of Glen. So, all of the questions that I asked, I was wondering, what is it that someone hasn't asked you about your work that you wish that they did? And this is my unique Glen question. Since nobody has critiqued your work the way that you found credible, what would be the critique, your own assessment of your own work if you were sort of, on the other side, shirts and skins, you're playing for the other team? Where would you say that your gaps in your thinking are? And then where would you say that you find, let's start there. I want to know those two things.
Some things that concern me that I don't think I'm likely to be able to tackle are, I'm most comfortable in dealing with thin representations in my work. Like, this token is some metadata about the communities that you're a part of, or this currency is a representation of, etc. I'm not a natural language processing person. I'm not a person capable of interacting with things that are richer than natural language, like virtual reality and stuff like that. How those things integrate into all of this, I think is a huge gap. I think the communities that we're describing are constituted by those richer interactions. What it ultimately should mean that you and I have a shared soulbound token is that we have conversations like this, or richer conversations, richer exchanges than this. That's possible over Zoom or whatever. And that is not something I have the skill set to add much to, other than to highlight the need for. I think that's super important. Other people are working on it, and I'm really excited about that. But I don't have that capability. So that's one lacuna for sure.
Do you ever get asked about that sort of human and humane aspect of your work all the time? Because those communities that you mentioned are actually largely complementary of your work.
Whatever the DeFi people say or whatever, there's infinitely more religious people or people steeped in continental philosophy or whatever that will not even find a point of access to a lot of what I'm saying, because they're so focused on those practices that don't interact with the thin quantitative representations effectively. And ultimately, as much as I may respect them, I'm never going to have the same nexus to meaningfully address their concerns that I will have for these other communities. And so they may not even have the point of access to start those critiques. It's the voices that are unheard in many cases that are the most important critiques.
That sounds like a spiritual movement, Glen.
You have to perceive what is said by those who are less able to express it as much as you perceive by those who want to say things most loudly.
Discernment. Interesting. Where are people exploring your ideas the most? What's the deep end of the soul-bound token and DSOC?
I'm very lucky to have a very interesting and challenging set of collaborators, people like Danielle Allen, Matt Pruitt, Divya Siddharth, Pooja, Vitalik, these people are constantly pushing me, and they come from very heterogeneous starting points.
That seems to be a very interesting and relevant point, Glenn, is that it again is actually something that you talk about in terms of plurality and in terms of difference being the value here. How have the people who have influenced you in your life, who are they? How have they impacted you? Was sort of, I guess, where I was going with that. That points to that richness. It basically seems like you're trying to create an algorithm or something that's written in code to provide for human complexity and richness, right? Like this, it felt spiritual. And your writing seems to me to have what I would call something that speaks to my own sense of my own, mi alma, right? And that seems to come through. And I wonder how much of that is Glenn and how much of that is Glenn influenced by his community.
I'm not sure that there's a difference. There's a thinker, Michael Sandel, whose work I very much admire and who's a friend. He critiques meritocracy, this notion that I did it. And he also sort of reluctantly embraces, but he's kind of uncomfortable with luck. Like it happened randomly. Mm. And I think, one of those, you could say the first is almost like Newtonian mechanics. And the second is kind of like randomness, quantum mechanics or something like that. Or what in the language of applied mathematics they call simplicity versus unorganized complexity. But ultimately, the interesting thing is organized complexity. And I think that, the organized complexity view on what we've done is that I am the intersection of my communities. I am the person who is at the right place at the right time. On the other hand, there's nothing to me other than being that person who was there at the right place in the right time. I am constituted by that. So it was me who did it, because there's nothing else that is me other than that.
Well, Glenn, that's one hell of a quote to live your life by. That's probably one of your quotes that I'm going to take around with me. I learn about you. I learned from you. I'm very glad and lucky that we are friends. I can't wait to share you with the world. It was an honor and a pleasure to try to pretend to begin to understand an actual viable future based on your hopes and dreams, Glenn. And I'm very, very, very grateful to you.
Take care, Mona.
Bye, G. See ya. Our time is up for now, but the conversation is still going. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at Sino Global Cap, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and leave us your feedback so we can loop it into upcoming episodes.